The peasants marched on London, occupied the city, and the king promised to accept all their demands. But when the peasants had withdrawn, the king sent his armies out, and thousands of the peasants were slaughtered. And an example was made of John Ball.
The Reverend John Ball was hanged, drawn and quartered. That was the way they did it then. They hung you up till you were almost dead, cut you down while you were still alive, disemboweled you, cut you in 4 bits and put it up on sticks to warn everybody else.
The peasants' revolt is remembered because of John Ball's words and the use of the Bible to justify the claims for equality. These ideas have remained ever since and are still powerful today. But the idea that Parliament is the same as democracy is another great myth we ought to look at. Because although earlier in 1295 the first Parliament had been summoned by the king, it only happened because he realized that to retain power he had to create the impression that he recognized the rights of the wealthy by consulting them in a regular way. But of course the common people had no representation whatsoever.
I mean, Parliament, you know, is a French word meaning a talking shop. Parler, you just talk about things, and no power from the people for that. So the confusion of Parliament and democracy is another confusing idea.
Over the centuries, the power of successive kings became stronger and stronger, and it reached a climax in 1649, when there was a civil war between Parliament and King Charles I, sometimes known, and I prefer to think of it as the English Revolution. Cromwell, leading the parliamentary forces, defeated the king. He was executed in Whitehall. And even though the monarchy was restored in 1660, Parliament acquired greater power, though it was still not elected, of course, by the people. Among the many thinkers since 1649 was Tom Paine. Paine was a Republican whose book, The Rights of Man, was burned by the public executioner as seditious. And what Benn said was, government cannot be the property of any particular man or family, but of the whole community. It is wrong to say that God made the rich and poor. He made only male and female, and he gave them the earth for their inheritance. The turning point that led us towards the democracy we now have began as a result of a conflict between the landowners and the workers they employed.
The landowners owned the land and they owned the cottages on the land, so if an individual farm labourer caused trouble or went to complain, he was sacked and evicted from his cottage, and that was the end of the trouble. So the agricultural workers in Dorset in the 1830s realised that if they want to have any power at all, they had to get together. So what the Tolpattle martyrs did was they swore an oath of secrecy, so no one would be allowed to know that they'd formed a trade union. Well, those oaths were illegal oaths, so they were taken to the magistrates' court in Dorchester, and they were convicted and sent to Australia to, like, common criminals. There was enormous protest about this, huge demonstrations.
250,000 people signed a petition for their release, and 30,000 people marched down Whitehall in their support. So what had started as a local campaign became a mass movement for the establishment of trade unions. The principle that ordinary people could only achieve their rights by organizing themselves was now established. That's what the protests against the arrests of the Tolpuddle martyrs achieved.
This was a huge gain for working people. They realised that the laws under which they were governed were made by a totally undemocratic parliament. In 1832, which may seem a long time ago to you, but it was only 18 years before my grandfather was born in 1850, in 1832 only 2% of the population had the vote, and they were all rich men, and they made the laws. And so, following the emergence of trade unionism, came the campaign for the vote, the Chartists.
The really significant political change began when people who had been excluded demanded the right to be represented themselves in Parliament. For over 4 years in cities up and down the country, they worked and a charter was prepared for the representation of the people. It demanded, for example, that all men should be allowed to vote, and that any man could stand as a member of Parliament. 6 million people signed the Charter before it was submitted to Parliament. And, as so often happens in history, the powerful had to concede some of the demands to avoid trouble. More and more people won the vote, and working together, staying united, was what the Chartists discovered was the crucial missing ingredient to force the wealthy to share power.
And you could then see quite clearly what democracy did to the balance of power. Because what democracy did, even in its very elemental form, was to transfer power from the marketplace to the polling station, from the wallet to the ballot. People who didn't have the money were able to vote for candidates who would provide collectively what they couldn't afford personally. All sorts of other economic consequences followed. Municipal schools, municipal hospitals, municipal fire brigade, municipal museums, municipal art galleries.
Of course, many of the advances that were made as a result of local democracy benefited the family and benefited women, but women's rights, which they had demanded right back into the 17th century, were still denied. And as they saw the vote extending to working-class men, they said, what about us? And they began to organise separately to win the rights using the same arguments that had been used over the years to win the rights for men.
And the women fought with tremendous force and power, and they chained themselves to the railings. They were arrested, they were put in prison, they went on hunger strike, they were forcibly fed by wardresses, and the government got so frightened at one stage that they passed what became known as the Cat and Mouse Act, under which if a woman was on hunger strike, she was released from prison until she had a meal and then rearrested and put back. The government played like a cat playing with a mouse against those women who were campaigning for the vote. There was one very famous one called Emily Wilding Davison, who in 1911, the year of the census, hid in the House of Commons in a broom cupboard. And then when they said to her, Miss Davison, what was your address on the night of the census? You know, that's the question. She said the House of Commons. And 2 years later, she threw herself at the King's horse at the Derby and died. And I put up a plaque to her in the broom cupboard, had it made myself, screwed it up, didn't get permission, got a photograph of her, and if ever you go to the House of Commons, ask to go to the broom cupboard, because that was a reminder of the struggle women had.
After decades of struggle, women were only given the vote after the First World War in 1918. But they were only allowed to vote at 30. Because men were so arrogant, they thought you can't trust the wife till she's a little bit older. And it wasn't until 1928 that women and men got the vote at the same age.